Hi, and thank you for joining us today with this discussion about the MBTA Communities law that will be implemented shortly in Abington. My name is Shawn Reilly, and I am the Abington Town Moderator. We have a town meeting coming up on Monday, April 1st, at which one of the articles will be a vote about whether Abington should implement the new zoning bylaw that's been required by the state. Most people refer to the MBTA zoning bylaws. Today with me, we have three representatives that are working on and with the Abington Planning Board, who we're going to try to share as much information as we have possible right now to try to inform the viewers at home about what this MBTA community zoning bylaw is all about, and frankly what it's not all about. So seated right to my immediate left is Rick Collins. Rick has been a member of the planning board for over 10 years and has a lot of historical background. Since over 20 years you've been reporting on housing issues, both as a newspaper reporter and as a legislative aide in the Massachusetts State Senate. Judi Barrett is from the Barrett Planning Group, who's been a hired consultant from the town of Abington and many other communities around Abington and around Massachusetts, helping communities interpret and adapt and adopt this bylaw. And then finally we have Liz Shea, who's been working with the Abington Planning Board for over 20 years and is now our Abington Town Planner. So what we'd like to do is, my guests here have put together a series of PowerPoint slides with basically some basic information about this proposed MBTA zoning bylaw. And if you don't mind, Judi, I'd love if you could start us off and kind of bring it to our viewers at home, the information on the slides and anything you want to add to it so we can kind of have a working knowledge to start our discussion about.
Certainly, I'd be happy to. So I think you're going to start up the slides here. Here we go. Yep. So the first part of this presentation, the slides, is really an overview of the law. And Liz will talk more about the specifics for Abington shortly. So the MBTA Communities law is an amendment to the State Zoning Act. We call it Section 3A for short, because that's easier to say than MBTA Communities law. It applies to 177 cities and towns around the greater Boston area out to Worcester County, pretty much any place that has MBTA transportation service. And the purposes of the law are really threefold. First and foremost is to address the housing crisis that exists throughout the Commonwealth and especially in the greater Boston area, to encourage more multifamily housing development, especially where there's transit service, and also to just boost the state's housing supply in an effort to gradually kind of stabilize housing prices. So this was adopted by the legislature in 2021, and it's being administered at the legislature's direction by the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. So what is an MBTA community? As I said, it's 177 cities and towns in eastern Massachusetts. It includes rapid transit communities like Quincy. It includes commuter rail communities like your own town, Abington, Bridgewater, and Kingston. Rail-adjacent communities like Rockland, Pembroke, or Hanover. And adjacent small towns like Carver, Plimpton, and West Bridgewater. Why do we have this law? Well, first of all, there's a statewide effort, and really even beyond Massachusetts. I can tell you we work throughout New England, and this is a conversation that's happening New England-wide about providing more housing, a variety of types, sizes, and scale, and a range of price points to grow a healthy economy and be able to house our workers so we don't lose them. The fact is that the high cost of housing in Massachusetts is pushing out our college grads, our young families, older adults, and people with moderate incomes. My own firm lost a young planner several months ago who moved to New Mexico. She may have taken a slightly smaller salary, but she is saving $12,000 a year in housing costs. And that's a real story. And my firm is just one of many that's been affected by this. Also, the law is really just to create more housing stock in the hopes of stabilizing prices, allowing older people to downsize if they choose, and in doing so, helping younger families become homeowners. There are basic requirements in the law and some that are a little more complicated, but the basics are that you need to have a multifamily housing district where multifamily housing is allowed as of right, which we'll explain more in a minute, with a density of about 15 units an acre. And in many districts, it's a little bit more than that, just because of the way the compliance process works. But it's around 15 units an acre. You can't have age restrictions in that zoning. You can't limit the unit sizes. the number or size of bedrooms or number of occupants. It's very much designed to allow a variety of households, including families, to have more choices about where they'll live. If you have a transit station, which you do, a lot of the district, or at least a significant portion of it, needs to be within a half mile of that rail station or subway station, depending upon the type of community you are, wherever that is possible to do. The district, quote, must be of reasonable size. That was the wording by the legislature, and it's become more definite through the administrative process with housing and livable communities. Compliance is ultimately determined by the Executive Office on Housing and Livable Communities, which was essentially directed by the legislature to come up with detailed guidelines to implement this law, which has kind of a very broad mandate. So what is a district of reasonable size? Through the EOHLC guidelines, we know that it is typically 50 acres. In most communities, that's what it is. It could also be the lesser of 50 acres, or 1.5% of the community's developable land area. At least half the district must be contiguous parcels, and that is to ensure that you have meaningful areas within which to develop multifamily housing. In most cases, if you have the district in multiple locations, which many communities do, there must be contiguous areas of at least 5 acres so that you have, again, usable development sites for multifamily housing. Zoned capacity is a concept that is embedded in the compliance process for this law. It really is about how many units does your zoning district need to be designed to accommodate if one were to try to permit the multifamily development in that district. And the zoned capacity number is a little different for each community. In your case, it's 1,022 units. It is not it's not a requirement to build housing. It is not limited to vacant land. It is not concerned with existing housing that may be in the district area that you propose. It really is about the numerical capacity of the district to accommodate a certain number of units. So the law does not require new housing development. I think there's a lot of confusion about this. It really is about having zoning, not having construction occur. It does not require communities to provide infrastructure. If a developer chooses to apply to build housing in this district, it's really the developer's responsibility to provide the infrastructure to serve that housing. So your town would not be expected to provide water or sewer or other services in conjunction with the project. It doesn't override the Massachusetts Wetlands Act. It doesn't override Title V, which is our environmental code. It doesn't override other local bylaws outside of zoning. And it doesn't provide any exemptions or waivers. If a community decides that it doesn't want to comply, there's really no way for a community to get an exemption. You're either in compliance or you're not. So what if the benefits of the way this process has unfolded with assistance from the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities is it is clear that as of right does not mean a developer can simply walk into the building department and get a building permit. You are allowed to use a process called site plan review, which you already have in your community, to regulate aspects of the project, such as access, the safety of vehicular and emergency access, pedestrian circulation, architectural design, landscaping, what is this project going to look like? How is it going to feel on this site? How's it going to relate to what's around it? And then, screening of adjacent properties where it makes sense to require that. You may require up to 10% of the units in a development to be affordable housing that would count toward your 10% minimum under Chapter 40B. You're not required to, but you may. And Abington, I know, is planning to request affordable housing as part of its zoning. So what is zoning anyway? We're often asked this as planners. My firm does a lot of planning work with communities in Massachusetts and beyond, and sometimes people just don't know what zoning is. So what it is it's a code that's adopted locally. In our towns in Massachusetts, the adoption mechanism is town meeting, and it regulates how land will be used. So it typically, when you open a zoning bylaw, which can look like a daunting book, it typically contains things such as how much development can occur on a site, how tall can buildings be, How big can they be? How many units, if it's residential, can be put on a particular parcel? Or how much commercial space can be developed on a given parcel? So it's about quantity on one hand and then use on the other. So typically districts will allow for residential use, such as single-family or multifamily housing, commercial uses, retail, office space, and so forth, industrial, such as manufacturing or research and development, or warehouses and transportation, transit services, and so forth, and then open space. Those are the typical uses that you will tend to see in a zoning bylaw by area of a community. So within any given place, such as where you live in a zoning district, and certain things are allowed in it, both in terms of use and also quantity.
Thank you, Judi. Abington has had zoning for a long time. We first adopted it in 1954 and then adopted a zoning map in 1976. The district where we're proposing this multifamily overlay district has an existing district called the Transit Oriented Development District, or TOD. The town adopted that in 2003 to support a mix of uses around the MBTA commuter rail station. The TOD zoning allows multi-unit dwellings on the upper floors of a building with commercial uses on the first floor. The proposed zoning for the MBTA district is the Multifamily Overlay District, or MFOD, as you'll start to hear. So the planning board has been planning for the MBTA Communities District for well over a year. They received a grant, hired consultants, and studied several areas to locate the MBTA zoning district and satisfy the requirements of the new law. The area to the west of the commuter rail station along and around Center Ave. The second area was a larger district around the commuter rail station and extending a full half-mile around the station, and the possibility of locating 60% of this district at the airbase and 40% around the commuter rail station. The fourth district the board looked at and decided to be the proposed district meets the station area, land area, and zone capacity requirements. It will not require any additional changes to the zoning at the airbase. There is already a multi-unit development in that area, which may strengthen Abington's future grant request for additional infrastructure funding. So here we see a copy of our current zoning map, and way down in the right-hand corner you can see that red circle where the mini-me version of the district that is being proposed is located. And on the right-hand side is sort of the enlarged version of that. And you can see the parcels the board has chosen to be included as part of the multifamily overlay district. Here again is an up-close version with obviously some arrows and identity of where this zoning is. You can see the senior center, the commuter rail parking lot, where Summer Street goes through it, the Woodlands apartment buildings, which is off Summer Street, Progress Street, and behind the senior center is land that eventually takes you out onto Plymouth Street. So what does this look like in Abington? So this is 18 units per acre in Abington, and you can see 292 Central Street. The estimated residential units are 3, and the parcel density is 18 units an acre. 56 Townsend Street, which is off Adams Street, has an estimated residential unit capacity of 32. And again, this is the parcel density of 18 units an acre, which is what we're currently proposing in our zoning. If you want to bump it up a little bit, this is what 20 acres looks like, 20 units per acre looks like in Abington. 60 Dunbar Street, which is 21 units an acre, and 9 Platt Street, which is off of North Ave, would be 19 units per acre. To see how this increases, 25 units per acre is 33 Randolph Street, which is the old Congregational Church and actually where the town hall and library were once located. And that is 25 units an acre. 313 Washington Street is 25 units an acre. And then 81 Birch Street, which is near the old, help me.
Yeah, the New England Art
New
Building.
England Art Building.
Yeah.
Across the street from that, it was Mildred Alfred Nursing
Right.
Home, and that is 28 units an acre. 30 units an acre Now we're at the Point, which is 36 units an acre. The Point is off Bedford Street, and this would be double what we're proposing in the zoning bylaw. And equal sort of to that is the Woodlands off of Summer Street, where it's 34 units an acre, and again, almost double what we're proposing in our zoning.
So if I can interrupt you for a sec. So
Sure.
what you're saying is you couldn't build the Point or the Woodlands under the MBTA zoning bylaw as of right?
That's correct.
Because that is double what the MBTA bylaw
is.
allows.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. You couldn't actually build any of
many
these
units. Yeah.
units as well.
Right. Depending, that calculation, those slides were just showing this 18 units per acre. It confuses people and causes a lot of angst.
Right.
But it's very site specific because 9 units on half an acre is the equivalent of 18 units per acre.
Right.
Correct.
And some of those slides you were just showing was 3 units on 0.16 acres,
Right.
which was 18 units per acre if you multiply it out.
If you figure it out, yeah.
So it's, Liz, I think in the slides show you that what 18 units per acre is and what it's not. And I think it is eye-opening to know, to me it was at least, that the Point and the Woodlands are double what's allowed by this, which it was
Right.
kind of reassuring to me anyhow.
Right, and I think the Gables off of North Quincy Street also hits around that mark. Might be a little lower. I didn't want to throw too much in
Yeah.
here, but I think that's sort of in the same family as the rest of this is.
Sorry for interrupting.
That's
Go right
okay.
back.
That's okay. It's because the visually it does help you understand what that all looks like, which I think is important for everybody to understand. So what's at stake if we don't comply? So impact on noncompliance with the MBTA Communities law, Abington would be ineligible for the following grants: Community One Stop for Growth, which is formerly MassWorks and a lot of other programs. The state has now wrapped that all into one portal. Housing Choice and Local Capital Funds projects. So what? What does that mean for Abington? We would lose competitiveness for community planning, Massachusetts Downtown Initiative, which we're actually looking at this year, Urban Agenda, Rural and Small Town Development, Underutilized Properties Program, which is another grant we're looking at this year, Real Estate Technical Service, which we have received and are again looking at to apply this year, Commonwealth Places programs, land use planning grants, and municipal vulnerability preparedness, which we are in the middle of an MVP grant right now. How has Abington used these grant programs? So on the slide are some of the funds we have received and some of the projects that have been completed with grant funding. So as I said, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness 2.0 grant of $95,000, which at the end of that, we should be able to get seed money for a climate resilient project. $2.2 million from MassWorks and water treatment money, which was partly used for the Myers Ave well. Grant awards through the Complete Streets program, which were administered by John Stone, DPW Director. We received $5 million through the Clean Water Trust. The renovation of the roundabout, specifically at the high school, which we call the Excedra, that was all renovated using grant and CPA funding. $60,000 to conduct a trail design from town offices to the library and library campus to Broadmeadow Lane. That's currently in the design stage. $200,000 from Green Communities to install heat pumps at the senior center. That project is underway. I'm not sure if we are not compliant, if they take that money away from us or not. And $30,000 for the design to repair and restore Memorial Bridge at Island Grove. So that's just a handful. I think the DPW probably has received more money that I'm not personally aware of at the moment, and also moving forward. We're looking at grants to complete or initiate projects throughout town in the next several years, and we would not be eligible for any of those. That's like the third or fourth question on every application: are you MBTA compliant?
I spoke to the DPW this morning, and they told me over the last 5 years, they have taken in about $12 million in state grant money that could be at jeopardy if we don't enact the MBTA bylaw. I mean, it's something for residents to weigh, but
Right.
The DPW, as you mentioned, does take advantage of a lot, and that helps with our streets, our bridges, our sidewalks, our drainage, and all that.
Right. And another thing is the state TIP program, which does a lot for us in design and construction, and that's not on a list yet, but can they take that money? I mean, there's a bunch of questions here too about how far will the state go in order to help you become compliant, I guess is the best way to phrase that. So important takeaways, Abington is required to adopt zoning to allow multifamily housing by right. Abington is not required to build 1,022 units, and I have to be honest with you, it took me a long time to wrap that around my head.
Yep.
Because they give you a number, but you're not required to build that number. The proposed district only needs to be designed to allow it, but we don't have to build it. Abington is not required to provide any new infrastructure, such as water and sewer lines, roads, sidewalks. I know sidewalks are an issue in some areas, to accommodate new developments. Developers must comply with all DEP regulations, conservation regulations, site plan review, and water and sewer restrictions. And other bylaws we have on our books, they would be required to comply with those. The proposed zoning requires 10% of a development's units to be affordable, which I think is the right way to go with this, because it keeps our numbers stable with what we're required to produce under Chapter 40B. And if Abington does not adopt this zoning, we'll become ineligible for state grants and question mark. I don't know what comes in the future. And there could be other consequences. The state is taking compliance very seriously. So I guess now we can talk about what we all just learned.
Thank you guys for putting that slide presentation together. Kind of gives us a baseline of material. Rick, I wanted to ask you, as a member of the planning board for the last 10 years, can you just give the viewers at home a little summary of what the planning board has been, how you've worked through this process since the legislation was passed, in 2021, I believe?
Yeah.
Yep. Our approach at this point has been to remain in compliance, and I certainly could understand kind of the initial feeling of, this is another state mandate, let's push back, let's fight against it, which the town is still welcome to do, but I think remaining in compliance is really the appropriate strategy as well. You can do two things at once. So we've kind of been taking the steps and following the requirements to move forward. We've identified areas we wanted to look at. For instance, we looked at the existing transportation-oriented development district, which has been in place since 2003, and that's a lot of the land directly around the commuter rail station. We looked at whether or not we could split it off and apply part of it to Abington Center, which historically had been a lot more densely developed than it currently is now. It's largely parking lots now, where it once was a more thriving commercial center. We looked at whether or not we could apply it to Union Point, since half of our land, or part of our land in Abington, is in Union Point, and it's pretty close to the train station in South Weymouth. What we ultimately decided, what guided a lot of those discussions, was how can we implement this in a way that reduces impacts on the community, that still abides by smart growth development philosophies. One thing you see, I think, going through this, Judi, maybe you can talk a little bit about it, is a lot of communities, when they were developing this commuter rail train, especially the Old Colony, they didn't want the stations downtown. So they pushed them to the outskirts of their towns, into more undeveloped areas. And a lot of towns have since regretted that decision. They actually want to bring the stations back into the downtowns. But what that means is that when they have to now zone this district, they're zoning it in an undeveloped, more rural, set-aside area. Abington's area is thankfully between almost a couple commercial districts. So we had more options to help this kind of blend in nicer with less impact on the surrounding neighborhoods. So I think ultimately we decided that because we already have a number of large-scale developments either built or permitted, and these are the 40B project off Summer Street, the 40B project off Plymouth Street that's located behind the Senior Center, and the existing Woodlands, as well as the apartment complex across from the MBTA entrance, that it makes it very nice and neat to just essentially say, okay, this is our multifamily zoning district. It's already been vetted, approved. It lays on top of it nicely. It meets the requirements. It's kind of a neat way just to be able to abide by the rules and with a minimal impact on a surrounding town, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up about how the towns regretted where the station was. I mean, historically, some of the stations were already built, and so you had to work with what you worked with. But the 1,022 units, that's the big scary number in Abington, and other towns it's different. Explain to me why we keep saying, but it's not going to happen. I mean, you mentioned on the slides, but there's restrictions that the developer, no matter whether they propose to build 10 units or 110 units, all the rest of the zoning bylaws still apply, correct?
So this is one of the interesting things, and Judi can certainly jump more into it. If a town doesn't have water and sewer capacity, it essentially doesn't have to approve it. Or it can require
approve
the project.
Development.
They might have to
They
still have to enact a bylaw, but right.
Or if there needs to be, for instance, in our district, we have along Summer Street, there's 2 failed intersections on either side. Sidewalks don't go all the way along the roadway. These can all be part of things that are required for the project. Well, if the developer doesn't want to pay for it, there is no project. So ultimately, I think the state's going to have to cough up a lot of infrastructure grant money to help support this if they really want the units built. But that's a really interesting piece of this law that I think makes it a little bit more digestible.
And
I agree.
I think one of the biggest restrictions in Abington and in Rockland, which Abington is a commuter rail community, Rockland is an adjacent community.
Right.
But both towns are restricted, like any other town, with the amount of water or sewer. In this case, it's water. That I see as a resident as the number one restriction on any future development, whether this MBTA bylaw is in effect or not, right? And so just because if this MBTA bylaw does get approved, it doesn't say that they can just ignore water restrictions and they can get any water they want.
Absolutely not. I mean, they have to serve the development. You can't just build a building and put people in it and not be able to provide water, fire safety, and so forth. So,
and just to clarify something you said earlier about the infrastructure, if there is water capacity available, like any other person wanting to build a single family or a 10 family, fine, they can get it. But the point of this bylaw, as I understand on the slides, is the town's not required, though, to extend the water main down this new road they want to build. The developer has to pay for all of that.
as they would in any other development.
Right.
That's absolutely true. The town is not on the hook to provide, and basically to invest in allowing a project to go forward. They have to provide the zoning for it. That's the limit of the town's responsibility.
Right. And to follow up with that, we sort of discussed this earlier, it's not a 40B. Right.
Right.
There's a component of inclusionary zoning to keep us on track with our affordable housing numbers, but this is not a 40B. It does not put them at the top of the line for water or sewer. It doesn't allow them to get waivers on zoning and conservation, or like a lot of those other things that you get when it's a 40B project, right? When you're going through that process, it's a different process permitting than it would be for this. This type of project in this zone would go straight through the process like it happens right now.
Because Chapter 40B is a different law that's already in effect. That's the affordable housing bylaw.
Right.
That requires all communities to have at least 10% of their housing stock to be affordable housing.
Right.
Abington is very close to that 10% number.
Yep.
Like 9 point something right now. We're doing much better than other communities in the
To
area.
your credit.
Yeah.
And so the idea is, the proposal the planning board's bringing forward is to have that 10% minimum for any project that is submitted under this that constructs 10 or more units. Then you need at least 10% so that we can kind of maintain our...
Because that's how the state law works. For every 10 units, you have to have a unit. So that's, in order for us to not lose that 9.9, well, the 9% where we're at, to not lose any traction on that, this would keep pace with that.
Right.
And I got to say, too, Abington is... You guys have done a good job because the transit-oriented development district, as Rick, you mentioned, has been in place for 20 years. And it was specifically designed to allow multifamily housing near the train station so that people could walk to the train and not use their cars and try to basically allow it. Now, you might need special permits under the Transit-Oriented Development District bylaw. So the other thing that changes here in the big scope of things is the MBTA community bylaw. You don't need the special permit for the use. It's now just saying you can build multifamily housing as of right, as long as you comply with wetlands regulations. You get water, you get sewer, you satisfy parking and traffic concerns and all that.
Yep.
Right?
So when we review housing projects, there's multiple pieces of that review that takes place. There's the, is it appropriate? Does it look meet requirements? There's kind of it's what's called the site plan review of it. But then also sometimes there's a different vote that happens at the same time. Is this allowed to be used for multifamily housing? So for instance, when you build into transit-oriented development in Abington, there's two different kind of hearings almost concurrently at the same time. It's
Right.
reviewing the plan itself, and then there's also maybe often our requirement is that it has to be a mixed use. So if it's just strictly residential, is this okay? Does it fit in with the character of the neighborhood? Is it good for overall for the community? And that's a whole separate kind of question that we have to answer.
Right.
Under this law, that question is already answered. The answer is yes, you can build this, and then you have to go through the rest of the site plan review.
Yeah, the use is allowed.
Right.
Yep.
But the construction is going to be restricted by all the different requirements. And Judi, to that point, if someone had hypothetically a 10-acre parcel of land and half of it was wetlands, and someone came in and said, I want to put 18 units per acre, so I had 10 acres, so I want 180 units. What can the town, or what would happen, how would that play out?
Well, they still have to comply with all the other town requirements. So, you know, the height is going to limit what they can do. So I'll compare this to a 40B. If I had that site and I were proposing a Chapter 40B development, I would be allowed to ask for waivers of the town's height limit, building coverage, how much of the lot can be covered by structures. Anything I need to do to build that project at that 18 units, I would be eligible for waivers for. But under this zoning, that's not the case. You still, if you want to do 18 units an acre, you can propose it, but you still have to meet the parking, the coverage, and the height limits. And if you're losing half the site to wetlands, it's going to be very hard to do. I would say probably
Frankly,
impossible.
impossible.
Yeah,
right?
it really is impossible.
Right. And I think, Liz, some of your slides showed what density really looks like. Sometimes,
Yeah.
you know, it may be a small part of this district. And I guess we should also explain that this is what they call an overlay district, meaning before this gets enacted, there already are zoning districts all throughout town, and we showed the map earlier, and you can see it online if you go to the town's website, abingtonma.gov, and go to the planning board or the zoning board page. But the town has different zoning districts, and in this specific area where the MBTA overlay district would be, it kind of hovers over the existing districts, and those existing districts in this area are the transit-oriented development district, and there's also a portion which is what we call R20, which is residential development that allows multifamily with a special permit, much like the Todd district already does.
Right.
And so this overlay district is there, but if someone owns the land there and wants to develop it, they actually can choose and say, you know what, I don't need to follow the MBTA regulations because I don't want to build that many units. I want to build a mixed-use building like the Todd district already allows. I like to do that. That's fine, right?
Yeah. Do that.
So that doesn't change. The underlying zoning doesn't change at all. It just gives a little more flexibility for someone to come in and say, I want to go the multifamily route. Fine. That's the first box you check, but now you've got 10 more boxes. Am I reading this right?
Yeah, you are. I mean, it creates additional opportunities. So if you choose to stay with R20, you can do that. If you choose to do TOD, you can do that. If you choose to do this, you can do that. So it's creating some opportunities for development.
So we're going to take a quick break in a moment, but if you're interested in this or if you have more questions after watching this show, a couple things you can do is go to the town website and look at the planning board's page, abingtonma.gov, and then go government planning board, and it'll be its information available to you. You can watch this on YouTube. If you're watching this on cable TV, you can also go on YouTube or go to the Abington Cam website, which is abingtoncam.tv, and you can watch the show anytime you want on the internet. And you can also go to a public hearing that the planning board is required to have before the town meeting, and the public hearing is scheduled for Wednesday, March 6th at 6 p.m. at the town hall. Wednesday, March 6th, 6 p.m. You can go there and ask your questions or express your concerns at that hearing. But hopefully this show is going to hopefully answer and educate you. As town moderator, I think it's important that when people come to town meeting, they have as much information as possible. So that's the intent of the show, is to get the information out to you. But please submit your questions to Liz and to any member of the planning board. Go to that public hearing on March 6th, and hopefully you'll come to town meeting on April 1st. So we're going to take a quick break, have a little public service announcement, and we're going to come back with a little bit more detail about the MBTA Communities law that's being proposed for your approval at town meeting on April 1st.
You're so right for me, and I'm right for you. I love the things you do, like sweet tasting wine. Your lips are so divine. Your loving turns me on. My lonely days are gone. That's why I'm never gonna let you go. Never gonna let you go. Babe, I'm never gonna let you go. No, no, never gonna let you go.
Here you go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, welcome back to our discussion about the MBTA Communities zoning bylaw, which is going to be up for a discussion and a vote at the Abington Town meeting on April 1st. I am joined once again with Abington Planning Board member Rick Collins, along with Judi Barrett from the Barrett Planning Group, a professional consultant that's been hired by the town of Abington, and of course Liz Shea, who's our town planner. Getting back to where this overlay district is, this new MBTA zoning district, it is obviously near and surrounding the commuter rail station, which is located off of Center Ave, or between Center Ave and Summer Street. Yep. Let's go back as to where the boundaries are and why that was chosen as being proposed by the planning board as the most appropriate for the town of Abington.
So the requirement is that the district is within a half mile of the commuter rail station. And if you draw a half-mile circle around the commuter rail station, you end up all the way up by Stop and Shop and Target on one end. You end up just shy of Abington Center on the other end. You wade into Island Grove Pond on one section. So, I mean, it's a pretty big area that we got a chance to look at for this. So what we did was to try to figure out what makes the most sense based on what's there, on if these units are built, what would have maybe a minimal impact on the community and the neighborhood around it. I think one reason we stayed away from, perhaps looking at Target and Stop and Shop is because we don't want to lose the commercial properties that are already there.
Right.
So we took a look, and we know that obviously the Woodlands has been in existence for about 20 years now. The land to the bottom right of it, they're kind of a square, 2 square parcels. That's where another 40B has been approved. That's the Plymouth Street one. And as you see, there's the commuter rail parking up near the top. Below that are 2 long parcels, and that's where the Summer Street one has been proposed. So they all kind of run together. They're all contiguous. They all connect. And our opinion was that this, because of what's already permitted and what's already built, that this would have the lowest impact on the community.
Because you're essentially not allowing, in a cynical way, you're not allowing any kind of large new multifamily projects to be located elsewhere as of right. If someone wanted to propose something anywhere in Abington, they have to comply with current zoning bylaw.
Yeah, and the issue is, if you look to the left or the right of the MBTA station, you start to get into wet areas. You start to get into very small residential parcels.
Right.
And I think what we wanted to do was to avoid kind of the situation where you have just lots of little developments,
Yeah.
where you have a lot of half-acre lots or third of an acre lots, and now you get 7 or 8 units on each one of those lots kind of moving up the street. I think that's what we want to avoid. So we thought just kind of looking at it from a big picture, looking for the kind of the bigger parcels, and that's what we ended up with.
And Judi, as the map shows, a good portion of this overlay district that would allow the MBTA housing as of right, meaning with no variance and no special permit for the use, a good portion is already developed. The Woodlands apartments are already there. In fact, part of this overlay district is the actual T-station parking lot. But that still complies with our requirement to have at least 50 acres.
Right, so that you're not required to put the entire district on vacant land. You are, and many towns are looking at areas that already have an established development pattern, because it kind of makes sense to locate a district for, you know, moderate density housing in those locations. So this is very similar to, I think, what a number of other communities are looking at.
And I think this goes to your point earlier, where we have to enact a bylaw that would allow 1,022 units, but in reality, the district, it's impossible to build those units because most of the district's already built out, and a good chunk of the remainder of the district is wetland restricted. So we may not see anybody come forward and use this MBTA bylaw in Abington because we already enacted bylaws 20 years ago that allowed that to be developed, and it has been developed over the last 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, you've been really ahead of the game here in many ways. The fact that you've had a TOD district for...
Kudos to the planning board.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of towns that would not be doing this, but you've had a transit-oriented district for a while. You know, what you did here really was very consistent with what was happening really in state government around setting sort of land use policy of encouraging smart growth. So, you know, it was really in the early 2000s that we started to see more transit-oriented district activity happening, not necessarily in the smaller towns like yours. So that's why I'm saying you were really ahead of things here, and I think that has positioned you well to now take the step to the MBTA Communities law and make it work.
So how is it different than Milton? Milton just had a vote where they rejected their bylaw. How is, or in what way is it different in Abington or some of the towns around Abington versus Milton or Quincy? Or
so it's important to remember that Milton Town Meeting approved the zoning for their MBTA Communities compliance, and through a referendum vote that was initiated by unhappy voters just last week, the referendum overturned that zoning vote. So really within a matter of a couple of days, Milton was informed that a couple of state grants they had been awarded were being rescinded. And we don't know what else is going to happen there. But Milton is classified as a rapid transit community because of Mattapan Station. And I think there are some people in town who think that's not correct.
And rapid transit, just to clarify, is the subway system.
It's basically the subway, yes, and the trolleys that operating, you know, within the city limits or the city area. So Milton has other issues that they're aggravated about, but most communities, I think, are not taking that tact.
And I know your company, Barrett Planning Group, is working with several other communities, many other communities, I should say.
We are.
But I know you're working with some that are local to Abington. What is going on in and around Abington?
So we're working with Whitman, and we met with that wonderful planning board a few weeks ago. They were very on top of things. It was good. They kind of knew where they wanted to put the district. We had worked with them on trying to analyze an area that made sense from a, you know, the half-mile radius perspective, you know, that applies to them as well. And they have a zoning bylaw that they're planning to take to town meeting. There may be a few more tweaks to it, but I think it's substantially there. We're also working with Plymouth, you know, which is the largest town and area in the Commonwealth. So their requirement is higher than yours, even though they're not a commuter rail community. They're adjacent community, but the town is so big. And so they were looking at where in Plymouth are there already areas where we have development. So if you were going to do some infill, some additional, it would work. And that's the approach that they are taking too. And those are just a couple that come to mind. We worked with Rockland. We're actually not there right now. I think they're trying very hard in Rockland to make it work. They had landed at a location that I think they felt made a lot of sense. that I think the planning board had already been interested in perhaps zoning for some higher density development. So I think that's probably what they're planning to do, which really from a land use planning standpoint makes sense. Those are the ones that come to mind.
I have a quick question for you on that. So as a train adjacent town, Rockland, what are their restrictions on where
They have to have an
where they need
eligible
to be located?
So
District, yes.
Yeah, the district has to be in what's called an eligible location, which is not well defined, but the concept is essentially where there's transit or where you have like an established commercial area, where the community has kind of designated an area for growth. So the law is not encouraging communities to put a district like this kind of out in the middle of nowhere with no access to services and so forth. So, every town has to make an eligible location claim. It's just that it's easier for you folks because you have a train station.
We have a train station.
But in some of these other communities, it's a little bit more of a challenge. And we're working with communities kind of throughout the Boston area on this, and some have had a harder time with that option, with that idea of what's really an eligible location. So you're in so many ways in Abington, you're poised to succeed with this in ways that I think are more of a challenge for a lot of other communities.
So in communities that have commuter rail like Abington and Whitman and Hanson and Kingston, part of the statute requires them to basically put this up to a vote to implement the bylaw this year, basically.
Yeah.
And in towns that are adjacent communities like Rockland, like Plymouth, their deadline is the following year?
So the commuter rail communities and the adjacent towns, the Plymouths, the Rocklands, you all have the same deadline, which is December of 2024. There's another group called adjacent small towns. Plimpton is an example. Their deadline is the following year, 2025.
Okay. Now, let me ask you the cynical question. One of the main reasons that the state was pushing this, and some would say jamming it down the town's throats or the city's throats, all the different communities' throats, to get more housing, because there's been obviously a supply shortage of housing. And there's also the cost of housing, whether you're buying a single-family home or renting an apartment, has just been through the roof over the last few years. And so the thought is, well, we're going to make them build housing. And will it really drop housing prices, though? I mean, in the end, if Abington adds another 75 or 175 units, are we really going to see rents go down or prices go down?
So that's a fair question, because I think that some communities do sort of wonder if we were to build 1,000 units in our district, does it matter a hill of beans? And I think the real issue is not whether an individual town's supply changes the equation. It's when you think about 177 communities in this region, and if all of them were doing their part, like you're trying to do your part, then I think you begin to see a different conversation about pricing stability in the market. But it's a macro question. It's not about 75 units in Abington here or 100 units in Rockland. It's the macro effect of dealing with the supply problem that's been created by the constraints on development.
Yeah, and I think it's not only is it so seniors want to sell their houses and downsize, there's young couples who want to move out of the house and get their own apartment, but it's also businesses who want a workforce who can afford to live. Now, we see it like, if you're a firefighter or a carpenter, you can't live in Boston. It's just too expensive. And Rick, I know we were talking about how it affects this law affects communities like Quincy or Cambridge much differently than Abington or Whitman, just in pure numbers.
Yeah, so because a city like Quincy and Cambridge are rapid transit, that I think it's a 25% growth in housing units they need, so their numbers are significantly higher than Abington's. And really what you're going to see is if, the impact of a Quincy and Somerville and Cambridge and Boston, they're going to be able to, at scale, have a much higher impact on the number of units able to be created than just, a Whitman, a Rockland, and an Abington. But I think what they're trying to do is to say that every town needs to have some skin in the game if you're going to benefit from the MBTA. system,
That's
which
right.
is an argument you certainly can make. But I think the point is right, is that Abington is not going to change this alone.
Right.
If they build 1,000 units, you're not going to see prices necessarily drop. I think it's that scale when you start seeing 100 units per community across Greater Boston. Well, now you're talking not 100 units, now you're talking 10,000 units. And that certainly has a large macro impact,
Right.
complex. But one of the things that I'll say is that I think in some ways it's easier for a Malden, a Cambridge, a Quincy to absorb development like this than an Abington, because they have unlimited water and sewer through the MWRA. They have built out infrastructure. They have sidewalks and parking and intersections that work.
Right.
And a lot of towns like Abington, in order for us to absorb it, we have to make significant investments to do that. And I think that's where kind of the tough part is going to be for our communities, and why we're going to need to see that state investment in supporting local infrastructure. Because right now,
Right.
all the major economic development grants available are not eligible for housing projects. Well, that's great, but that's what towns need in order to support these.
Right, in towns like, the Miltons, the Quincy's, whatever, their zoning allows a 10-story apartment building, whereas Abington, in this bylaw, would only allow a 3-story building.
Well, Milton doesn't.
Yeah.
But Quincy does.
Thank you. But,
Yes.
and that's where each
Yeah.
communities are different.
Yeah.
But the bigger inner cities are going to satisfy this requirement with maybe a taller building and a smaller footprint, whereas in Abington and Whitman and all, you're not going to see that there. It violates the bylaw.
Different scale. They're
Yeah.
different communities. But I think that if you work in those inner core communities a lot, which we do, they've really been carrying a burden already. They've been increasing supply. So they've been doing it through their zoning. They've been doing it through Chapter 40B. And I think what this law is saying to all of our communities that have a connection to the T is there's this public infrastructure that's a significant benefit to our populations, but there's a disproportionate burden being placed on a few communities to house the region's workforce, and we need to equalize that out. And so, the scale of development to satisfy this law in an Abington or a Rockland is not going to be what it would be in Cambridge. I don't think anybody expects it to be, but it could be more than it is. And that's the whole point of the law. It's like making sure everybody's contributing to what is a regional problem.
Well, what about the question, and I think I know the answer to this, but let me put the question out there to you guys. The bylaw requires, if you make a proposal that has 10 or more units, then 10% of those units must be affordable. Based on the town's level of affordability. Why not more?
So there is a provision that a community could require more than 10%. But in order to do that, you have to commission an independent study that shows going over 10% will not make the development of this housing uneconomic. And we've done a few of those studies. There are a couple of consultants who've done many more than we have. And I can tell you that except in communities with really already very high rents and market prices, you get over 10% and the economics start to not work. It's kind of why with 40B developments you see such density. Because in order to make 25% of those units or 20%, depending on the project, affordable, it just takes a lot of market activity. 15 units an acre just doesn't do it. 16 units an acre, it's not enough. So the Commonwealth, I think, in an effort to say to communities, we understand why you would want to get some affordable housing out of this, even though you're not required to, 10% works. If you're going to go over that, you got to prove that it will still work. And what we're finding is it generally does not.
Just because the cost of construction, the cost of land purchase?
The cost of financing, the cost of construction. I think a lot of people just don't understand what's happened with the housing market. Why would they? If you're stably housed, you don't know. But there's a real knot that's happened, and the cost of construction and financing is a big piece of it. Developers just can't make these projects pencil out. So development is kind of not happening at the scale that it needs to. And meanwhile, homeowners who may have a very low interest mortgage are not going to sell now and to downsize or whatever and take on a higher rate mortgage. They're staying in place. So what that means is renters aren't leaving the rental market into home ownership. So it's a big knot that something has to happen, and it's got to happen on the supply end.
And yet, as we've been emphasizing, our existing zoning bylaws, our restrictions, our water restrictions, our wetlands restrictions are still in place. They're not negated whatsoever by this bylaw. This bylaw just allows the opportunity in this limited area, the overlay district area, which we showed earlier on the map near the T station. That's only what this directly affects. Now, we mentioned earlier that the law also says that the town can't restrict, say that you can only build this if you make it 55 and over. But a property owner could propose to do that if they wanted to.
Oh, absolutely. When it says you can't require age restricted, it doesn't say, but the developer can't propose it.
Okay.
It just simply says the town can't place these restrictions on development. So if a proponent wanted to do age-restricted housing, that's consistent with all the requirements of the bylaw, they can do that.
What about, again, it talks about a restricting number of bedrooms. If in many of the developments in the Todd district and in other districts through Abington, I think has done a pretty good job in most cases restricting apartments and condos to 1 or 2 bedrooms for multiple reasons: water use, sewer, school impacts, things like that. This bylaw would not allow the town to restrict the number of bedrooms per unit. But there's a flip side to that, where the developer then has to demonstrate that he can get enough water for more bedrooms, he can have enough parking, because the larger the apartment, the more parking is required, things like that, right? So it's still going to be subject to all the restrictions.
The parking does not vary based on the size of the units.
Oh, under the bylaw.
Under this bylaw, there's what we haven't talked about, and I'm sure we could spend hours talking about it, is the analysis that has to be done to show that a district will comply. And it's based on a geographic information system model and also feeding a lot of information to Excel and coming out with a magic number. Does it add up to your zone capacity number or not? And the model is designed to penalize requirements for excess parking and to kind of reward enough density to make the whole thing work. So it's really a market question then at that point. Does the developer feel that he or she, that there's enough market demand for 2.5, 3-bedroom,
Right.
when I say 2.5, I mean 2-bedroom in a studio or 3-bedroom units, and if that's there, then that's what they can build. And I think, to your point, one of the problems with the housing conversation in many communities is around the subject of schools. And the reason that you can't put restrictions on bedrooms, on unit sizes, is that many communities have placed constraints on development that essentially say families aren't wanted here. And that's created its own set of problems. So it's one of the things that you just, under this law, you cannot do. You provide for the zoning to build a certain number of units, and it's really up to the market to determine where is the demand. And if it's for a lot of 1-bedroom units, that's what's going to get built.
Right, and typically, I think the thought was building near the commuter rail station. You might need less cars because people are going to jump on the train. If they're going to travel locally, they might have a friend or they're Ubering, or they have one
Right.
car instead of 2 cars. Most of those, young urban professionals only need 1 bedroom, maybe 2.
Sure.
So the majority of what has been built near commuter rail stations has been the smaller apartments.
Absolutely. I mean, I think when people reach the point in their lives where they want to have a family, that is not the environment where ultimately they
Right.
want to stay. However, because housing supply is so constrained right now, and we're not seeing single-family housing freeing up, you have folks who are still in rental housing who, under any other market conditions, would have moved out into a single-family home or a townhouse or something, and they can't do that right now. So it's a market mess, is what it is.
Right?
It is, and it's something, as you said, it's not an Abington problem.
Right.
It's an issue throughout the state, and this is intended to get 177 communities to kind of chip in,
Yep.
to try to make something better for all of us. It's going to take time to implement, time to permit, time to construct. But I guess, hearing from you guys is to do nothing is worse.
Right.
Well, you know what a unicorn, a single-family home for sale in Abington is, right?
Yeah.
It's just there's no housing stock here.
Right, and it's, the town has changed over the years, and it's true in every town. I hear it, I'm in the real estate business, and it is true. I mean, the entire population of the world is growing. And we all have to kind of, take care of the earth and try to take care of each other. And I hope you get the sense that the people here at the planning board want your input. They want you to ask questions. They want you to understand, I think importantly, what the MBTA Communities bylaw is, and in some cases, more importantly, what it is not. So when you get to the town meeting on April 1st, we'll have, I'm sure, a brief presentation again, and we'll have some questions, and we'll take a vote on whether the town wants to endorse this or not. If you're really interested in it, as I mentioned, your hearing is March 6th. That's a Wednesday night, 6 o'clock at the town hall. It's a public hearing. Anybody can go and you can ask questions. I'm sure you'll hear a lot more of the same information that we put forth tonight at that hearing once again. And the planning board will take some final votes that they'll then bring to town meeting. Anybody have any kind of final summaries of what you want people to take home about what this is all about or what it's not all about?
I certainly can understand people's hesitancy to embrace this or desire to push back and not want to comply. But I think that it's important to remain in compliance for a number of reasons. I think you can both encourage changes if you don't like the law, and if the town decides it wants to see changes in the law, it should support it through their legislators and band together with other towns and make those changes and fight for them and push for them. But I think they need to do that while remaining in compliance with the law. And right now the law is you need to have a zoning district. We know that if you don't, some of the things that will happen, we'll start to lose grant access, and there are going to be possible repercussions that we don't know fully yet.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know what the Attorney General might want to do for communities that don't comply. We don't know how that plays out with the general market in the town.
Right.
And other economic impacts. So I think it's I think as adults sometimes we have to do things that aren't the most fun things. And I think one of it is let's remain in compliance, let's adopt this bylaw, but then if we want to see other changes, then let's go and pursue those as well. I think you can do both things at the same time.
Well said. But before we go, let me ask you one further question. This whole, I'm going to call it a threat from the state about if you don't comply, we're going to take away your grants. And there's some people out there, I'm sure, saying, so what? So what? Give up the grants. What do we need the grants for? What does that do for us? Is it really worth it? How do you answer that question? Is it worth it? Those grants are money?
Absolutely has been worth it. We've gotten projects done that didn't cost us $5.5 million. I mean, there's a contribution on our part that we have to make financially to get some of these projects done. But, say a project is $10 million and we get 5. We're only 5 out of pocket, $5 million out of pocket.
Otherwise, the Abington taxpayers are paying $10
right,
million.
We'll be paying $10 million. And what would that look like, in a budget season where money might be tight, but we have to do a water project, right? We have to comply with the PFAS situation, for example, right?
Which is where some of that grant money's going.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly
Yeah.
where that's
right.
going is to help clean that up. And so then what do we do if we don't get grant money for that $5 million? Let's just say that I don't know what that money actually was, but let's pretend it was $5 million. Now the town has to come up with another $5 million. Where does that come from?
Or
Right?
don't do the project.
Or don't do the project, and then we're in trouble with the federal government.
Yeah.
Right? So state, federal government, I guess. But let's try not to be in trouble with anybody. Let's try to make it all work and keep moving forward. But absolutely, I think Abington has greatly benefited from grant money, small and large.
So go ahead, Judi.
Well, I also think people should remember your town was already ahead of the game in looking at this area for transit-oriented development 21 years ago.
Yep.
So this isn't a new conversation in Abington. It's an extension of a conversation that's been going on for a long time. And I think you should be proud of that, frankly. The town has been really doing planning here that a lot of towns have not. So you're not creating something out of nothing. You're really working with zoning that's already in place and tweaking it, if you will, so that it works with this law as well. And I would really sing that song if I were you guys.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you to our viewers at home who've been watching this. Zoning is not always the most exciting thing to talk about, but the four of us here are just kind of knee-deep with zoning, and it's something that, you know, we don't have all the answers, but we're trying to get the answers. So if you do have questions, there's an email you can address we want to share with you so you can send an email if you have a question right to Liz Shea. It's lshea@abingtonma.gov. All right, Liz Shea, but just L Shea, and Shea is S-H-E-A. So there it is right there on the screen, lshea@abingtonma.gov. If you have any questions, send it to Liz, and they will try to bring those questions forward to the public hearing on March 6th, or if we have a significant amount of questions, maybe we'll tape another show. But again, the goal is to try to share the information, and I hope that you will share this information with your friends and family members, encourage them to watch the show. Again, you can go to abingtoncam.tv if you're on the internet and watch it there. You can watch it on local Abington cable TV. You can go to the town's website, abingtonma.gov, and it'll be links there. But one of the best things to do is get out of the house, come on down to Town Hall on March 6th on Wednesday night at 6 o'clock, and there'll be a hearing there to discuss it more. But most importantly, for this and for many other reasons, April 1st is our town meeting, annual town meeting at the Abington High School. Starts at 7 o'clock. Please be there about 20 minutes early to check in. This will be one of many things on the warrant. The warrant will be available soon, and you can get that on the town website also. So kind of circle those two dates, Wednesday, March 6th, and Monday, April 1st. And please, you know, if you're not part of the solution, you can be accused of being part of the problem. So hopefully you'll be there and voice your concerns and cast the vote the way you feel is best for your family and for your town. So thanks for tuning in. I want to thank our guests once again for all the information. It was very helpful. And I hope to see everyone at town meeting on April 1st.